afternoon, everyone. Delighted to see so many of you here. I think we're a little loud, Dean, if we can bring it down a bit. Thank you. It's such a beautiful fall day. Has this been a great fall or what for North Dakota? This has just been gorgeous, and so we're gonna try to continue these fall days here from now on until May or so, but we probably won't make it. Delighted today that we're not living in Minneapolis. I understand there's some real problems down there today. So, but we really are, Clay and I are exceptionally delighted that so many folks would come out today to listen to the two of us talk about what some people would consider sort of an obscure historical figure, but we certainly wouldn't agree with that. We think he's a very important figure. For those of you that have never been here before, and I do see some new faces in the audience today, I'm Larry Scogan. It's my good fortune to be the president of Bismarck State College and participate in these discussions with my good friend and certainly the best humanities scholar that North Dakota's ever produced, Mr. Clay Jenkinson.
Oh, please.
Yes.
You lost your credibility already.
No, it's absolutely true.
Don't start with the whoppers already.
Yeah, well, it's true. So what is that too loud for you folks? No, it's okay.
It's just a little echoey, but it's okay.
Echoey to us, but that's okay. We don't have to hear ourselves. So if you're okay with the sound, then that's good. I thought we would start off. Clay's had a pretty busy schedule since last time we were here, and we held a big event here on Eric Sevareid, and I know you've got some more things in the offing, and this audience likes to know what's going on. So you got some thoughts about what's transpired in the Sevareid Symposium and what you got going?
Well, of course, we want to get right to Otto von Bismarck here, but first of all, the Eric Sevareid Symposium was an amazing event, in some part owing to the staff at Bismarck State College, but it was held here and it was of national importance. And some of you didn't get to come to it. I've talked to a lot of people who were at the Hustfest or, were doing other things, but it's all archived at sevareidlegacy.org. If you go to sevareidlegacy.org, it's gavel to gavel in high definition. And you were here, Larry. Some of the things that occurred were just unbelievable. We had Marvin Kalb from Georgetown, from DC, on a video link for a conversation, and that was remarkable. And then we had a recreation of the moment when broadcast news was begun in 1938 during it's kind of related to what we're talking about, during the German absorption of Austria. And it culminated with a field trip up to Velva on Sunday morning, which was just unbelievable. We had these people from around the country. We had guests who were participants, and then we had speakers and presenters, and also we had Eric Sevareid's son, Michael. He had 3 children, twins, Michael and Peter, and a daughter, Christina. And Michael came, he's in his 60s. He had never been to North Dakota before. He had certainly never been to Velva before. And we took him up to Velva, and he was just overwhelmed. And these national presenters had come. Some of them stayed, some of them couldn't. And Iris Swedland up at Velva, and the people of Velva put on this feast, this smorgasbord. And these national people had never really seen anything like this in their lives. The hot dishes. They had an array of hot dishes and this beautiful pork that had been done by the store, the grocery store up there. And then we North Dakotans do bars, and other people don't really do this.
You're talking about little bars?
Yeah.
Eating, okay.
And there were like 17 varieties of bars. And these national people were taking notes. It was really sweet. And Eric's son, Michael, was asked to go into the house. The rest of us didn't, but he went into the boyhood home of Eric Sevareid. It was a magical event.
And Dan Rather and Bob Schieffer and Bob Edwards, Nick Clooney.
Right.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So that was great.
Bob Schieffer the next day on Sunday actually talked about being here and participating in the symposium, which I thought.
And that was one of the things I love most to do is to call attention to North Dakota. And so when we were planning this, and this involved Brenda Doherty of the State Humanities Council, who was a full partner and did just a tremendous job, And my private dream was that when Bob Schieffer got home, he had to rush off because he had to face the nation live on Sunday morning. And my dream was that he would say, you know, I spent some time out in Eric Sevareid country this week, and he did.
Yeah.
And it was so cool that he talked about Sevareid and being here, and that Sevareid was from here, but he also used that, this was just before the election, he used that as a way of producing a commentary on civility and the lack thereof in the election of 2010. So he used Sevareid in a really appropriate way.
Yeah. That was sort of a theme I thought ran through the whole thing, was this lack of civility today. And one of the reasons we do what we're doing, that we can have conversations about things, we can disagree on things on a very civil level, and that certainly seemed to be a theme through the whole symposium.
Well, it was a different era. Sevareid was, the reason why he became America's commentator for those 14 years on CBS Evening News was because he had this even-handedness. You know, he didn't just do what pundits do today, just say, here's my opinion, or here's the way it should be. He always evaluated and placed things in a historical context, and something that's really, really important, and it is so missing in our time. No matter what his own view, he always tried to show respect for the other points of view that were not his own. In other words, he didn't just assume some sort of righteousness because he had opinions about something. He believed that in a democracy, there's room for a range of perspectives and that they're not necessarily to be polarized and demonized just because mine is this perspective and yours is that. And so we showed on Saturday morning, and some people here were here for this, but on Saturday morning we had a long panel and we showed, I don't know, pieces of 20 or 30 of his commentaries, his television commentaries that I had gotten from the National Archives of this at Vanderbilt in Nashville. And the people in the audience, you could just sense their respect for Sevareid, their sense of nostalgia for, in a sort of sense, what went wrong with this country's public discourse, and a longing for that sort of graceful, literate, complete sentence kind of commentary that he represented. And you know, to think that he's one of us. He's a North Dakotan. I mean, he arguably is the most extraordinary writer that North Dakota ever produced. We're just fortunate to have him, and I thought the symposium was really world class. So enough on that.
Well, and compliments to you. I thought it was excellent as well. So you got anything else in the offing here? We've got another conversation coming up, by the way. You should have all gotten one of these that talks about the conversation series. And in December, we're going to be talking about John Steinbeck right here at this location on the 12th of December at 3 in the afternoon. And
Steinbeck was here, of course, in 1960. He was here on Columbus Day 1960, and I'll talk at some length about this on December 12th, but he came into the state and he crossed the entire state in a single day. He was in his camper. He had an early camper, pickup truck camper, and he and his dog Charlie, this poodle, had gone in search of America. He felt that he was out of touch with America, that it had really hurt his writing. And so he decided, campers were really new then, and he bought one. He called it Rocinante, after Don Quixote's horse. And just at the last second, his wife was concerned about him. His third wife, Elaine, was concerned about him, that his health wasn't great. And she said, why don't you take the dog along? And so he takes Charlie, the dog, and really the dog is the making of that great book, Travels with Charlie. And so when we do this, I'll show how this day unfolded. This was one of the great days of his journey, and he stopped at Maple River, just west of Fargo, on Old Highway 10. And there used to be a little, some of you may remember this, there used to be a little turnoff, it wasn't really a rest area, but it was a kind of a parking area. And he stopped there. He had a way of doing laundry, and he was doing laundry, and he says, well, now that I'm in the middle of nowhere, maybe I'll reflect on the journey so far. And so the longest single chapter of Travels with Charlie is in North Dakota, as he sort of sums up everything that's happened to him thus far in the journey. So we'll spend some time on that. It's really, and then that's not all we'll talk about, but that book is the one book that has a North Dakota connection.
Okay, you got anything else going on, or are we ready to get into Otto?
Let's go.
Let's go into Otto, okay.
What do you got going on?
Oh, a lot. We're
Want to
busy.
talk about it?
No. Look, I'd rather get into Otto
Okay,
von
let's do it.
Bismarck here. We talked about we ought to sort of set the stage about why we're even looking at somebody like Bismarck and sort of the humanities questions we're going to deal with today.
Well, remember when we thought of this, we were, I believe, having a glass of wine somewhere, and at the time it made a good deal of sense. But
Usually does.
Bismarck is named after Otto von Bismarck, and it's surprising how little a connection Bismarck, North Dakota really has with the legacy or even a biographical understanding of Bismarck. And so I thought it would be interesting, you did too, for us to sort of talk a little bit about Otto von Bismarck and to try to reflect a little bit about why there's this disconnect. Mm-hmm. There are very few states that have their capitals named after somebody. Helena, Montana, Sacramento, California, Olympia. You can go through the list, but there are very few states that are have a capital named after somebody. Interestingly enough, 2 states to the south, Pierre, South Dakota is named for Pierre Chouteau, one of the early fur traders in the Jefferson era in St. Louis. And Lincoln, of course, is named for Abraham Lincoln in Nebraska. St. Paul, Minnesota is named for the historic St. Paul, but most states don't have that sort of a capital. And ours is unique in that it's named after the leader of another country, and a very important one. And so I thought that would be interesting to look at that. I'm also interested in here's my question for you, Larry. You've done most of the work. I mean, you've read all these books that you have over here. And what made Bismarck? What made Bismarck Bismarck? I don't really understand that, because his youth was very unsettled, and you would not, very few people who live anywhere ever become famous, let alone become the essential figure in the making of a country. He is to Germany, in a sense, what George Washington is to the United States. What made Bismarck Bismarck? I want you to answer that question.
Yeah, and I think we will as we talk through this. So let's just head into this and start looking at some slides. We got some maps, and we'll have a full discussion.
But let me just quickly say, we also want to talk about why this matters to us, and then in particular, how North Dakota's capital, which was once named Edmonton, got to be named after Otto von Bismarck. So go ahead.
We're going to do that. Okay, so today we're talking about Prince Otto Edward Leopold von Bismarck Schönhausen. Schönhausen was where he was born, and we'll talk some. And I gave you a very detailed timeline, so you can kind of follow along as we're talking through here, and far more detail in that than we're ever going to get into today. I find him a very interesting guy, and what intrigued me as I started to do some research on this is I ran into this. First is a video. I can tell you as a historian, I would like to verify that this is really what they claim it is, but it's claimed to be a
well, who else would
picture
it be?
of, I don't know, it looks like him, doesn't it? Yeah, I agree.
What are the other possibilities for?
I have no idea. Mike McCormick and for Halloween or something, I don't know. Could be Mike.
But this is a very early piece of film.
Very early piece of film, and it went nowhere. There was no place else to put it in this whole discussion, so I just put it up front here so we can take a look at it. But anyway, I found that interesting. But what I really found intriguing is I found this website and where they're saying Barack von Bismarck, talking about President Obama's efforts at social reform. I found this incredibly interesting. And some of the...
Go ahead.
Go ahead, yeah. And this was after the election. I'm not so sure, Clay and I were talking earlier, I'm not so sure that when Johnson was doing the Great Society, people would have said, well, that's Bismarckian. And I just found it really interesting that today, all of a sudden here, almost by coincidence, we're going to be talking about Otto von Bismarck, and this blogger is talking about how our own president has a Bismarckian view of the world. And he goes in, and I don't expect you to read all of this, and my apologies to Jane Schreck, who would say there's far too many words on this slide. But he, he talks about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson and all of these large social reform movements that we had in the United States are really an attempt to implement a Bismarckian view of the world, which we're going to get into then as to what Bismarck did, because Bismarck did workman's compensation, old age benefits, health care, and all that sort of stuff, and we'll talk about how he got into that. So I just found that incredibly
But I mean, the only
intriguing.
way that Barack Obama would truly be Bismarckian is if he, let's just assume he has an agenda that we know part of and not all of yet. The only way he'd truly be Bismarckian is if he now is able to implement it in spite of the difficulties he's going to have with Congress. You're only Bismarckian if your will can overcome the existing institutions of your society.
Yeah. And I wouldn't call him Bismarckian simply because what motivates Otto von Bismarck, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But at any rate, I just throw that out as an interesting aside from doing the research on this to find out somebody's calling him Barack von Bismarck.
I think it's just a slur, really.
Do you?
I mean, it's just a way of slurring the current president. I don't think that's an insight.
Probably not.
I mean, I don't know what you gain by saying he's Bismarckian.
Bismarckian.
You'd have to really lay that out in a long argument.
Yeah.
He was elected president of the United States. Bismarck was never elected to be the Chancellor of Germany.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm not defending him. I'm
Yeah.
just saying I thought it was interesting that this blogger would use Bismarck to tie back to.
Go ahead and go
Okay.
on. Yeah.
All right. So I think Clay and I were talking the other day about this, how we were going to approach this. And so there's really three things that we're interested in, right? We're interested in the country of Germany, I think. And you and I were having this discussion about sort of geographical determinism that shaped Germany. And so I think we need to talk a little bit about that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I think we need to talk a little bit about that. And then obviously the man, as you alluded to, his background, how he ends up where he ends up in a historical sense. And then finally the tie back to North Dakota, because obviously that's why we decided we were going to talk about him. So to begin with, this is a modern map of Europe, and so you can take a look at where Germany is relative to this. And you were talking, Clay, about all the advantages that, say, France and England had as developing countries over Germany, really at the beginning stages. And if you take a look at Germany's access to the sea, for example, it's going to be tremendously important in the economic development of Germany. But what I would like to have all of you notice on these next few maps now, let's take it, Denmark sits directly north of Germany, so just keep that in mind, the Jutland Peninsula. And if you draw a line right down from the peninsula all the way down to Italy, you kind of divide Germany in half. And so we'll think about that as we look at some more historic maps of what happens in Germany, and we're going to
But the important thing to know is that when Otto von Bismarck was born in 1815, there was no Germany. There were a series of German petty states and principalities and kingdoms and so on, but there was no Germany in the sense in which we think of Germany.
Absolutely, and we're going to get to that. Okay, so first, and not to take us too far back, but the Roman Empire, if we take a look at how far the Roman Empire expanded, you can see if you draw that line again now, from Denmark going south, you can see that most of Germany was not part of the Roman Empire, so it was not organized under the Romans at all. And the first person that we'll find out that actually sort of organizes this area into any sort of what you might call a kingdom or an empire is Charlemagne, who is crowned emperor of the Romans, as I show you on there, December of 800. Now, his crowning is important to us only because we're going to talk about the Holy Roman Empire and so forth here in a little bit, but he's actually crowned by the Pope, and that becomes important because where does the authority of the king come from? And the church would say it comes from the church. And so we'll see we have centuries where the Holy Roman Empire, emperors that I'll talk about here in a minute, are crowned by the Pope. And then that becomes important because Napoleon will crown himself to say that I didn't get this from the Pope, I didn't get this from the church, I did this myself. And so that becomes important. So if we take a look at the Charlemagne, we can see again, drawing that line down the middle from about Hamburg, if you go down, we still haven't organized all of Germany, or German-speaking people. It's still, there's sort of forays into that area, but it doesn't go all the way. Then we end up with the Holy Roman Empire. And this, when we talk about Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich, and that's the Third Empire, where does it come from? Well, the Holy Roman Empire is the first. So if you take a look at this map, and Clay had mentioned all these principalities and so forth, and this map does not even give justice to it, that at the time that Bismarck then actually unifies Germany, there's like 360 principalities. So a map like this doesn't even give it justice, because they've got big chunks instead of all the very, very small ones. But what is of interest here is if you follow in the east the black line and in the west the black line, what we're basically doing is now we're starting to encompass a united Germany around German-speaking people. And it will then, of course, it goes south, it goes into Italy and all that, it goes all the way down to Rome. But up in Central Europe, this is the first real organization that we will see of the German-speaking people into something, and this is called the Holy Roman Empire. It was, Clay, an empire in the loosest of sense. The emperors are elected. The people that elect them are called electors. And so it really is individual principalities, and they're sort of brought together in this very loose thing that really begins to unravel with Martin Luther and the Reformation. Now, why that's important to us, and it will play important into when we talk about Bismarck too, is that it really divides that area into Protestant and Catholic. And this is a grand sweeping generalization. But generally speaking, in the north becomes Protestant and the south remains Catholic. And that becomes important to the organization of Germany later on when Bismarck is actively organizing it. Now, as you see, it says officially ends in 1806. This next map is a little bit busy, but what this shows is the conquest of Napoleon. So the Holy Roman Empire really is all done in 1806, and it's because Napoleon now has rolled across Europe. And so you can see on the far east side, the blue line there, that's intruding now into Russia, and that's Napoleon. So the Prussians and all the other German-speaking folks in the middle of Central Europe are really crushed by Napoleon. And then comes 1815. And as you know, Clay, 1815 is the end of Napoleon. And what we end up with in Europe is the Congress of Vienna that establishes under Prince Metternich what's called the Metternich system. And you'll remember Henry Kissinger was a Metternich scholar, in fact. And Prince Metternich, who is an Austrian, really presides over the Central Europe, and I'm really leaving a lot of details out here, thankfully, but really rules kind of over, not rules in fact, but runs the diplomacy for Central Europe. So anytime there are problems in Central Europe, the Congress of Vienna can respond to that, crush revolution, make sure that the monarchs stay in their seats and all that sort of stuff. A real reactionary power going on. Now this is important to us because this is Europe in 1815. This is the Europe into which Otto is born. He is born the 1st of April, 1815. So this broad expanse that we've seen, this attempts to organize the German language people and Central Europe, all of that then, Congress of Vienna in 1815, and that is the Europe that Otto was born into. And as you can see, as Clay's already mentioned, all these principalities, that's the Europe. And Otto is born at Schönhausen, which is west of Berlin, and he is only there actually less than a year, and then his family moves to Pomerania. Now, why this is important, Clay, is because now they're outside the German-speaking part. They're actually in Poland, what is today Poland, and that is where Bismarck will grow up. So we're laying this all out very quickly, and when I say grow up, by age 6, he is back in Berlin to begin his formal education. So his formal education begins at age 6, back in Berlin. So that's the Europe then, by 1821, that's the Europe that Otto von Bismarck will grow up in.
But, you know, Napoleon, I mean, in a certain sense, you could take it back to the American Revolution, because The American Revolution occurs 1776 to 1783, and then the next country that had a revolution was France. And Napoleon comes in towards the end of the French Revolution, and one of the great historical questions is, did Napoleon destroy the revolution, or did he embody and complete the revolution? But at any rate, Europe goes into a world war in the Napoleonic age, and the United States gets sort of ground up in it, and it leads to lots of trouble, and to a certain extent it leads to the War of 1812. But Jefferson and people like him regarded France as the next place where the human rights tradition and the revolution would occur. The revolution was much bloodier than the American Revolution, and after it, and Napoleon rolls over Europe and invades Russia and fails. Well, after Napoleon's demise, Metternich and the Congress of Vienna produce a settlement of Europe which lasts for 50 years. I mean, Metternich was a genius, and what he's doing is essentially reestablishing orderliness in the post-Napoleonic era, and creates a geopolitical balance of power and a settlement that really creates stability in Europe for much of the 19th century. But the flame that we lit in 1776 and that occurred in France in the late 1780s then bursts forth in 1848, which becomes a very signal moment in the history of Otto von Bismarck.
Absolutely. Now back to who he is, let's go back to his youth then. I suppose, Clay, we could say that Otto had a spent youth. He drank a lot, he caroused a lot, he dueled a lot, he was very good at dueling. He was not a very good student. He is often chastised by schoolmasters because he doesn't study, he doesn't like going to class. He actually hires, as he's moving, and he's going to study, he's going to become a lawyer, he's going to the bar. And as he's studying things, he hired what they called crammers, and these were people to get him through the exam. And he's bright enough that he could sort of ignore his studies, duel a lot, drink a lot. It says that he fell madly and violently in love often. And out of that, I mean, that to me, I guess one of the discovery things, Clay, as we were decided to do this, one of the discovery things is to find out that I expected more of a Spartan life, and that, you know, he was getting ready. And we talked, too, about whether or not he was a military guy. Turns out he's not really even a military man, and yet that's the image that most of us have of him, is he's a military guy.
Well, when he's born into the landed aristocracy, the lower landed aristocracy, belongs to the Junker class or the Junker class, and as a young man, his behavior was quintessentially that of those landed aristocrats. He was a kind of a lout. He drank unbelievable amounts, and he was a roisterer, and he was also a duelist, and I think in 1 year alone he fought 32 duels, and these were with swords. And what would happen in these duels, this is a very distinguished part of the German aristocratic tradition. There are books on this. But in one of these duels, you'd go up into a kind of an attic, and two people would face off with swords, and they would go after each other until enough blood had been let that somebody intervened. And it was a badge of honor to get a disfiguring scar. And many Germans lost eyes, lost parts of their hands, were deeply wounded or killed by this. And he himself had a huge scar that he regarded as a great sign of his authenticity as a member of this class. And so he was heading towards a typical life of a Prussian Junker, where you would never have heard of him. But then at some point he decides to get serious about his life, and he transcends that status and becomes a European diplomat of extraordinary capacity. So what led him to that conversion experience, do you think?
Yeah.
It's a question.
That's a question?
Yeah, it's for you to answer.
Okay, we're going to keep going.
You're not going to answer it?
Well, yeah, we are, but I just don't want to get too far ahead of myself here. Okay. So to begin with, that's one of the things in discovery that we found out as we started looking at his life, is that's kind of, I didn't expect to see that about him. The other thing that I found out about him, which I was really intrigued by, is this John Motley, is, an American historian, turns out to be one of Bismarck's best friends. And they're housed together at 2 different universities. And as Motley comes back to Europe, as you can see, he comes back, he's in the Russian legation, he's in Austria, he's in England, and these marvelous letters from Bismarck to Jack, as he called him, in English, pleading with him to come visit. You're not that far away, oh my dear friend, we long to see you, we long to be with you. Just very un-Bismarckian, to say the least. That he was, actually it's hard to imagine Bismarck had a friend, much less such a dear friend. And Motley was an extremely close friend of his. And so
well, he knew 7 or 8 languages, did Bismarck. He traveled extensively in France and England. I mean, this was, for all of that loutishness of his youth, he traveled extensively. He had a gift for languages. He could read Latin and Greek and most of the modern European languages. And he traveled extensively and formed a cosmopolitan view of the world. That makes him quite separate from the Junker class that he grew up in.
Yeah. So as we look at him as a young man, one of the things, and I was just sharing this with Clay earlier today, everything we've talked about in Otto, this is a letter that he had written to his sister back, first I should say, in the 30s, in the 1830s, he kind of goes from job to job. The guy can't hold down a job, and he will get angry. He doesn't like anybody telling him what to do, so he's got a boss. He'll get angry, and after 2 weeks, he'll just walk out. He's done. And so he's doing this around Germany, kind of trying to be a government official. He's been trained as a lawyer, and so he's trying to work at the bar, but he just can't seem to get along with people. And in one of his letters, he writes, "Thus do I drift on the stream of life, with nothing to steer by except the inclination of the moment, and I am fairly indifferent as to where the waters may cast me on the shore." No direction, and didn't seem to really care at this time of his life. And the other thing that occurs at this time that I found incredibly interesting is that he actually meets Prince William, who will become King William. And that's important because when Otto is buried, on his tomb is inscribed that he dictated is that a true servant of King William I. That's all it says on his tomb. And so King William is incredibly important to him, and we'll get into talking about some of that. But nevertheless, at the time, he is so conflicted in this life, but he meets then, he's in Berlin, and they're at some sort of formal function, and he meets Prince William, that's going to become his king. And Prince William says, "Why aren't you a soldier?" Because he finds out he's a lawyer. And he says, "Why aren't you a soldier? Junker class, he should just gravitate to that." And Bismarck says, "Well, Your Highness, I don't see any opportunity for advancement as a soldier." And the prince looks at him and he says, "I don't think you're going to advance as a lawyer." So, which he didn't either. He ended up, of course, becoming a statesman instead. So, at any rate, so what happens? Now this gets into the question, I think, that you were getting at, Clay. So Otto goes through this period in the 30s and even into the 40s, really finding himself. He dabbles a bit into the military. As a Junker and a Prussian, he is required. He's 2 years. He's in the military. He's an enlisted man, and he serves out that 2 years in what we would think of as the National Guard or the militia. He does that. Later on, he becomes an officer, and at the time that he's an officer, they call him Mad Bismarck. Because he goes through incredible periods of melancholy. He's drinking, he's dueling, and so they call him Mad Bismarck because he's obviously somebody that has no rudder on him whatsoever. And then the family estates are falling into disarray, and his brother and he decide that they will take over the estates. So they go talk to his father. Their father agrees that they will take over the estates, and there's 3 or 4 family estates. So they take over the estates, and actually they manage them quite well. Both of them do. They manage the estates well. And all of a sudden at age 32 in 1847, we see him now being elected to the Diet, and he marries. Now, his marriage is, I think, incredibly important at this point because, and I'm not sure, Clay, maybe you can help me connect the dots here, but the reason that his marriage is so important is Johanna, and I'll show you some pictures of her in a minute, but Johanna insists that Otto must be a Christian, must be religious. And up to this point in his life, neither parents were, neither his mother nor father. He was confirmed in the Lutheran Church, but he was not religious. His friends said that he had, at best, a skepticism about religion. But all of a sudden, as he's dating Johanna, and to her, religion is incredibly important. And so he accepts it, and I think, frankly, in sort of a Machiavellian way, he accepts it. You know, the old thing, you don't really have to be religious, but make the people think you're religious. And so I don't know how religious he was, but he's going to make Johanna think he's religious, because that's one of her requirements, is that he practices a religion, and he does that. But then from a political sense, and this is where we need to connect the dots, Clay, from a political sense, he absolutely believes in the divine right of kings, that a king is a king because God put them there. God ordained that king to lead his people. And he absolutely accepts that. And it just seems like an interesting philosophy for someone that has spent this whole life as a skeptic to all of a sudden believe in the divine rights of kings, or he believes in it for political purposes. And I don't have an answer to that. But he does become religious through his marriage to Johanna, and it becomes really an important element in his political life with the king. A couple of pictures. This one doesn't come in very good. That's in their youth. And then this is much later. Okay, Clay already made, and actually, Clay, you can talk about this, and that's the revolutions of 1848. What this map shows, every place where you see a red, like a little fire, that's where revolution broke out in 1848. So you want to talk about?
Well, just that these were the ideas that had begun in the Enlightenment and had found their expression in the American Revolution and in the French Revolution. And after the collapse of Napoleon, there had been a kind of a conservative reaction to all of this. But those ideas didn't go away. These liberal notions of freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the popular sovereignty, that people having a right to a constitution, certain legal protections in courts of law, etc. All of these things are percolating around Europe. It's basically called liberalism, and they burst forth in almost every country in Europe in 1848. The interesting thing about that, and in the end, all of those countries will adopt a series of constitutional systems quite like that of the United States and France. But what's interesting is this is Otto von Bismarck's first great moment, and his moment is to be utterly disdainful of that movement and to give his energies entirely to its repression. In fact, he tried to organize his own peasants. As a Junker, he was a feudal landlord, and he had his own peasant class, and he tried to organize the peasants of his district of Pomerania to march on Berlin and take the government back for the monarchy. Mm-hmm. But the king wouldn't permit him to do that.
And he was absolutely incensed. King Frederick William, in fact, some of the revolutionaries are killed, and the revolutionaries are going to have a funeral for those that were killed as a result of clashes between the army and those that were in revolt. And by the way, it was a very bloody clash, and the king then withdrew the army from Berlin. And then there's a mass funeral for the revolutionaries that are killed, and Frederick William goes to the funeral and stands bareheaded at the funeral. And Otto is incensed over this, because this to him is the monarchy is now kowtowing to these revolutionaries, and he comes off as a very, very strong reactionary to this whole thing, that we have got to crush this. We've got to crush it now, as Clay said. I'll march my peasants on Berlin, and we will crush it ourselves. And but he becomes completely reactionary about what happens in 1848, and it really steals his position in the Prussian government now. He is part of the government now, and it really steals his position that he is the reactionary. He's the one that talks about the divine rights of kings. He is the one then that's going to do everything he can to ensure that the masses are not ruling. And what's really interesting here, and we had talked a little bit about this, is the parallels between his view of the masses and Alexander Hamilton. And in fact, later on, Bismarck will establish chairs in universities, Alexander Hamilton chairs, because he believed that Alexander Hamilton was the greatest statesman in the world, which I find very interesting. So, not to belabor the point, we've got all this revolution going on all over Europe. Most of it is crushed, by the way. It absolutely is, although there are some constitutions that will come out of this. But Otto von Bismarck now is absolutely steeled as the reactionary within the Prussian government. So now, I would say that it is from this point on that Otto is now finding his stride. First he's finding himself, he finds religion, the revolution comes along, and now he's finding his stride. So he's appointed 3 years after he goes to the Diet. He's appointed now. He goes to the Diet at Frankfurt. Now, the Diet at Frankfurt, I think, is important, Clay, because there is a German confederation, but Austria is dominant in that confederation. What Austria wants, Austria gets. And now Otto is down there as a member of that Diet in Frankfurt, and he will, from that day forward, ensure that somehow he's going to neutralize the power of Austria and increase the power of the King of Prussia. He goes to Russia for 3 years as ambassador. He talks about being in cold storage.
Learns Russian.
And now this is incredibly important. Prince William will become King William upon the death of Frederick William. And we're going to talk more about that. Bismarck is appointed ambassador to France.
Learns French.
And then King William appoints Bismarck as minister-president and foreign minister for Prussia. Now, here's what I'd like to do is take a moment, Clay, and talk a little bit about Kaiser William I. And we're calling him Kaiser. He's not Kaiser until 1871. Let's say King William I. Here's another one of these points of discovery as we did this, which I find really incredible. The Franco-Prussian War will break out in 1870, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but it'll break out in 1870. What I didn't know until we started looking into this is that 3 United States generals went as observers with the Prussian army during the Franco-Prussian War. And one of them was Phil Sheridan, that we're all familiar with, I think. One is General Burnside, famous Civil War general, and another is General William Hazen. Now, after the war, Hazen will actually write a book about this. Now I'm going to take a completely different sidelight, and we're going to talk about modern time here. So I'm at my favorite bookstore in Mandan, Huntington Books, walking around, looking through the shelves, thinking, I'm wondering if I can find a copy of Hazen's book that talks about the Franco-Prussian War. And I asked, and they jump on the computer, and they said, yes, we can order it for you. So $30, and I've got this book coming on the way. Now, I expected to get this old book that was published, maybe it was republished or something, but originally came out in the 1870s, 1880s. So I expected to get an old book. Instead, Clay, right, I get a brand new book, which I find so interesting. Brand new book on the school and the army in Germany and France with a diary of the siege life of Versailles. And then I start flipping around and I find out that these are just published on demand. I think that's incredible. And you were telling you were at Harvard and had something like that.
Well, this is probably one of the futures of publishing, but Google owns X 100,000 books and other entities own books. They're usually books that have been long out of print and therefore they're not copyrighted, but these entities have digitized them. And now if you want a book like this, there's no point, you probably couldn't get this book in its original, or it'd be $35 or $150. So then now you go to this company and it's print on demand. And so there's a book in the public domain, it's been digitized, all they have to do is then download it into a printing machine, and these printing machines will proliferate all over the country. I saw one at Harvard, but they're everywhere now in cities, and then the books will be printed. And so you could print any book that is available on this system, and that's what you got here.
I'm just intrigued by that. That was fun, so I appreciate that. Okay, so what I'd like to do is take a moment to read a couple of paragraphs, and this Hazen's descriptions of, at that time, was King William I. And so take a look at his picture and think about him, and I'm going to read you a couple paragraphs. Okay, fair enough? So this is General Hazen writing. The whole air of the king is that of paternal kindness and good nature, sometimes amounting almost to fondness. He speaks in a quick, eager style, often accompanying his words with rapid jerks of the head and hand. Considering his age, the king is wonderfully vigorous. He was 73 at the time of this writing. It is evident that he bestows great care upon his bodily health and dress. He is about 6 feet in height, large without being corpulent, and steps with firmness and ease. He often rides 20 or 30 miles a day on horseback without inconvenience. Until his ascent to the throne of Prussia, he was a soldier in active command, distinguished by his exact and punctilious performance of duty and by his strictness in requiring the same of others. He never appears with a button out of place or a single decoration appropriate to the occasion neglected. He is known to have wisely said, excuse me, he is known to have wisely said that a kingdom may be lost by one neglected button, as this may be the beginning of negligence which will end in disaster. His popularity with the people of Germany is unparalleled. One of Bismarck's biographers said about Bismarck, because this is the man that Bismarck will serve for decades. One of his biographers said, although Bismarck dwelt in a strong castle, he always heard over his head the footsteps of a man under whom it was his destiny to live. I think that's a wonderful statement. So he always knew that he was serving someone. He always knew he had a monarch. So, William in 1862, King William, is having trouble with the Diet, the Landstag, the Parliament. He's trying to reorganize the army, and the army and the Parliament is opposing that. And so he talks to his ministers to find out who can reorganize the army for him. And Van Run, who was the Minister of War, says that Bismarck is the perfect guy. So he is invited for an audience with the king, and the king asks him if he, in fact, the king had already written a letter of abdication because he couldn't reorganize the army. The Parliament was against him. The king said, I'll just abdicate. And once again, Otto von Bismarck is incensed that the king would even consider doing that because of the rabble out here. And so he is offered this position if he thinks he can reorganize the army. Bismarck, of course, says, yes, I can do it. He becomes what's called the present minister. And in this speech he gives within weeks of becoming what would really be the prime minister. And this is what he's most famous for. And then he reorganizes the army. And he doesn't give a hoot what the Parliament says. And one of the things that's very different in Prussia is the ministers are answerable to the king, not answerable to the Parliament. And so he's doing things, and people are railing against him. They're saying that this is unconstitutional, you can't be doing this. And Bismarck's attitude towards this, in fact, at one point, when he's going to start a war. They say you can't start the war, and he says the state can start the war. It doesn't need your permission. And so he becomes the Iron Chancellor. Okay. Another discovery here, Clay, is Ferdinand Lassalle. Ferdinand Lassalle is a German Jew who's a socialist. He represents and has organized the parties exactly what Bismarck is opposed to. And yet, Lassalle, and he dies abruptly in a duel in 1864, Lassalle becomes a visitor to the Bismarck household. And Otto von Bismarck and Ferdinand Lassalle will speak for hours together about what's needed in Germany. And of course, Lassalle is pushing for things like workmen's compensation, we need child labor laws, we need old age pensions, all the things that I guess President Obama is being accused of in the Barack von Bismarck statement. And so Lassalle is pushing for all of these things with the Iron Chancellor. And the Iron Chancellor takes him as a guest. They exchange letters. They talk to each other for hours. I guess I was just amazed by it. Okay. There are two attempts on his life as the Chancellor. This is a sketching of the first attempt. Now, this really reminds me of, and for whatever reason, Clay, this really reminded me of sort of a TR moment. He hears a gunshot as he's walking down the street. He hears a gunshot. He turns around, and this young man's coming at him, shooting at him, and he grabs the guy's arm and then grabs him by the throat, and the guy keeps shooting at him. A number of bullets actually go through his coat. One bullet, in fact, hit him in the rib, but it bounced off. Must have been a pretty low caliber handgun that he had. So one bullet hits the rib and it bounces off. And then he goes to the prison and interrogates the man to find out why he was trying to kill him. And then he strolls back home, goes in his house, tells his wife, "Don't be alarmed, somebody just tried to kill me," and sits down and has a meal and is toasting. The king finds out about it and rushes to his house to make sure that his minister is okay, gives him a big hug. And so Otto and the king go out onto the balcony. A crowd is gathered. One of his biographers said that prior to this assassination attempt, Otto von Bismarck is the most hated man in all of Prussia. And then after this, the masses show up at his house to make sure he's okay. And so in typical Bismarckian style, he steps out on the balcony and he turns and he starts the cheer of "Long live the king," trying to get the attention back to the king. There's a second attempt on his life much later on, and he's actually nicked in the finger by a bullet. Okay, so now he has absolutely put himself in a position as the Iron Chancellor in Prussia. Now we will talk about the Wars of Unification, which is why we know him, and I'm going to go through these really quickly because I know we've got to get to North Dakota here. The whole Schleswig-Holstein question, if you remember from the map, where Denmark is at, they were German-speaking people just south of Denmark, and two principalities, Holstein and Schleswig, and so what Bismarck will do is he'll go to Austria and he'll say, we should really take that from Denmark, and so they start this very quick war with Austria, and it's successful, and now he says to the Austrians, okay, well, you can rule one of the principalities and we'll rule the other one. And then he very quickly turns that into a confrontation. So now he's figuring a reason to take on Austria. And he does, and there's a very quick war again. This is about 6 weeks long. The actual combat only lasted 2 weeks, and he's now defeated Austria. And then he turns his attention to France. And actually manufactures, it's called the Ems Dispatch. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but it looked like France was insulting the king of Prussia, because the Ems dispatch that came from the king to Bismarck, Bismarck actually dropped off a couple of words so that it sounded more insulting than it really was, and ended up in a war then against France. So we end up with the Franco-Prussian War. All of these happened very, very quickly. And now, what I would like to do now, and you can stop me at any time, Clay.
I don't know how, but let me just step back for a minute to talk about, to try to put this in perspective. I mean, so there are these wars, but what's going on here? Number one, Otto von Bismarck wants the unification of Germany. This is something that, this is percolating in the air. People from all German parties are talking about unification, and he wants to make this happen. And he decides to use war as an instrument to accomplish this. And so there's first the war against Denmark. It's a war he knows he can win, and he knows he can win quickly. And he brings Austria in so that they're temporary allies. Having thus extended the Reich to include German-speaking peoples of the north part of Europe, he now then trumps up a war against Austria and wins that war. And so now he has neutralized Austria as a serious other contender, because in addition to wanting to unify Germany, he wants Germany unified as a Prussian entity rather than as an Austro-Hungarian entity. So now he's used war strategically for a second time to vanquish and neutralize Austria as a serious contender. And then he goes against France to settle ancient scores, but also to extend Germany's power over continental Europe. And so he is a Clausewitzian. Karl Clausewitz wrote the famous treatise on war, never finished during his lifetime, but in it Clausewitz says, war is a continuation of diplomacy by other means, and diplomacy is of the same genre as war, but this side of firefighting. And so this is how Bismarck is not interested in war in and of itself. In fact, he hates war. But he decides to use carefully crafted strategic wars to accomplish his ends. And he's absolutely brilliant at it. But there's no notion of a just war. There's no notion of a war that you have no choice but to fight. He deliberately sets out to unify Germany, and he has it in his mind how he will do this. And when diplomacy breaks down, he uses war as an instrument of policy, and he does it with absolute mastery. And so this isn't just war. This is war in the war designed to create an end, and that end is to create a unified Germany under Prussian control with a Hohenzollern monarch at the center of it. So this is a Machiavellian man.
Absolutely. And we should point out that one of the realities of using these wars is the fact that what he's doing is he's bringing all these other principalities into the orbit of Prussia.
A few at a time.
A few at a time. First in the north, and then over here in the sort of the west, or the south, and then in the west, and so they're coming in at that time.
But he has two problems. One is he has to neutralize Austria, the other contender for German mastery, and he has to prevent France, which is a much more powerful country, from coming in and breaking up the possibility of unification. And you know, this is not exactly Jeffersonian politics. This is what's called realpolitik. Hard-headed, practical use of war as an instrument of national policy with no moral dimension to it whatsoever. In fact, Bismarck despised moralizing about diplomacy. He really believed that a country does what a country wants and has to do, and that all the moral talk is just nonsense. And so if you look at that, and for example, just look at the war we are still in but fought in Iraq. The minute we decided to go to war with Iraq, the first thing our government did was to make the case that this was a just war and it was a war of moral importance. Bismarck might use that if it was interesting to him, but he despised that kind of talk because he saw war as a naked, pragmatic affair, which really makes him very different from the Enlightenment tradition or the American tradition.
Right. And he used alliances just as easily and cheaply.
He said a treaty is only as good as till the moment you no longer want it.
That's right. Time to move on, and different alliances. What I would like to do now is take a second, and here's some pictures of Bismarck. This is, again, during the Franco-Prussian War, and I want to go back to General Hazen. And I just found this so rich to have these contemporary descriptions of King William and now of Otto von Bismarck. And so you can look at these pictures and listen as Hazen describes this. Now what happens is they show up where Bismarck is busily working, and the three generals show up, and they're going to be escorted into Bismarck's room. And now this is his first meeting with Bismarck. On being shown in, we found Count Bismarck busily engaged in copying with a lead pencil as thick as one's thumb some very rough draft of a document. He came forward and received us with warmth and a smile of genuine amiability and kindness, and after a few remarks upon the latest war news, begged to be permitted to finish his copy, which would take but a moment. He occupied a small room in which were a few chairs and a writing desk. He is something over 6 feet in height, with large frame, well filled out, but not gross. Hair quite gray and clear blue eyes. In conversation, the usual sternness of his countenance changes to kindness, with a manner of open frankness that cannot fail to win the listener. On finishing and dispatching his copy, he turned to us and, scarcely waiting for a fresh cigarette, began a very interesting talk of at least 2 hours' duration, in which he was the uninterrupted speaker. The whole manner of this remarkable man impresses one with his open, frank good nature, and his conversation reveals a mind thoroughly trained in the highest school of German philosophy and liberality. He speaks English perfectly and possesses to a singular degree the power of presenting subjects clear and forcibly. The idea of Bismarck's personal appearance generally accepted in the United States is incorrect, as it makes him 10 years too young and too precise in dress. His brow is heavy, and his mustache shaggy at the ends, like his hair. There is a remarkable fullness under his eyes, and he has that blonde complexion peculiar to the Germans. What a wonderful description. And I don't know about anybody else, but as I read that, I thought, that just doesn't sound like Otto von Bismarck. This sounds like a really likable kind of guy.
He gave a 2-hour monologue. I mean, in what sense is he a brilliant conversationalist?
Well, it didn't.
But I mean, it's a beautiful description of a man who, I mean, it takes you away from that German-Prussian helmet and the notion of him as a kind of a swashbuckler. He's a diplomat. He's one of the greatest diplomats in European history. But a 2-hour monologue, I mean, come on.
Yeah. That sounds like our dinners together.
Yeah, well, yeah.
This is a picture of the surrender of Napoleon III. It was really interesting in the last battle, and again, this is a very quick war. In the last battle,
of the Franco-Prussian War.
Of the Franco-Prussian War, I'm sorry, yeah. In the last battle, they've captured the army, and the king and Bismarck are talking, and they said, there is no way Napoleon is actually here. He wouldn't be that stupid. He was there.
Napoleon III.
Napoleon III. And so he ended up surrendering to the king. You can see Bismarck in the white coat behind him. Von Moltke is the general holding the two swords. And Vanity Fair at the time, in 1870, when all this was going on, published this picture of Bismarck, and it called him the ablest statesman in Europe. And then, of course, is the creation of the Second Reich, the Empire. This is the point at which there's a coronation of King William I, who now becomes Emperor William I. And now all of it is unified. Some wonderful descriptions come out of Hazen about this whole process. And when you think about all the princes we were talking about and bringing the princes into the orbit, the war was actually fought by the Prussians. And yet the princes are all there and all in their finery, and they're all decked out, and they've got their own generals. And as far as Hazen could tell, all they did is stood around. And the Prussians did the actual commanding, and they had the real generals that went out and won the battles and all that sort of stuff. Well, as this is going on then, these princes are being drawn more and more into the orbit of Prussia. And so we end up with the coronation.
And guess where?
Yeah.
This occurs in Versailles at the Hall of Mirrors, so that the birth of the United Germany occurs in France, at the conclusion of the Franco-Prussian War in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. That's an extraordinary moment for the history of Europe. There's a sort of an arrogance about that. Instead of doing this in Berlin, they declare the unification of Germany on conquered soil, in the symbol of French power.
Just a sidelight to this. Kaiser William, now the Emperor William, he was so frugal that when he got letters from people, he would just send it back to them in the same envelope. He'd just scratch out the old address and put a new address on it and send it back and forth. Well, at any rate, Bismarck sent him a note in an envelope just a couple days after this coronation, and Bismarck's sort of letterhead on that said that he was the Federal Chancellor, and William scratched off Federal and put Imperial Chancellor, because now it was an empire.
And who crowned the Kaiser?
Himself.
Why?
Because it comes from God.
Right, he was not going to let himself be crowned by anybody because he was sovereign.
Yeah.
And he would not legitimize the sovereignty of the people, the sovereignty of the petty German states, or the papacy. That he was a self-crowned Kaiser, and Bismarck worked this out so that this would be the way this ceremony occurred.
Yeah. You know, we didn't mention, no reason to, I guess, but after the Revolution of 1848, Frederick William was offered a crown of a united Germany from the Frankfurt Convention that I had been talking about, and he refused it. He said he would not take a crown from the gutter. Crowns didn't come from people. Crown came from God.
So this is exactly the opposite of the Enlightenment tradition and exactly the opposite of the United States, where we believe that the people are sovereign and all office, all authority derives from the people. That wasn't Germany's view of this thing, and it certainly wasn't Otto von Bismarck's. He's a Hamiltonian, but he is to Hamilton what Hamilton is to Jefferson. He's a super Hamiltonian.
Super Hamiltonian. So this is the German Reich. You know, there's still some principalities there, but everything that you see that's colored on this map is the German Reich. This is what Bismarck has been working for ever since he went to the Frankfurt Diet the first time back in 1851, and that is the unification of the German-speaking people without Austria. And in fact, they talked at the time there was a greater Germany and a lesser Germany. The greater Germany included Austria. The lesser Germany did not. And what Bismarck was working towards was the lesser Germany, to unify all the German-speaking people under the Prussian king. You were going to? Okay. So, that didn't take us long, did it?
But you still didn't answer the question, which is what made Otto von Bismarck?
Yeah. I don't know. What do you think?
Oh, I asked you.
Well, okay.
You did all this reading. I mean,
yeah. Well,
but I mean, why does somebody emerge out of the 30 million German people? There were people that were better positioned than he was. There were people that were better educated than he was. There were people who had a more nuanced view of German culture than he had. So why does this Junker lout suddenly, in midlife, become the ablest diplomat of Europe and the most important man in European history from 1860 until World War I?
Yeah.
You're not going to answer this?
Well, I don't know. I think part of it is timing. I think the fact that he was born in 1815 is not, it's probably a mildly interesting coincidence, but it was the perfect time for someone that, that wanted to lead. He wanted to lead, he wanted to be a leader, but he wasn't a sovereign. In fact, one of his biographers talks about the reason he wasn't Napoleon, because he never wanted to be the sovereign, but he certainly wanted to wield the power, and he did that. Sort of interesting, as he's serving his king, anytime there was a disagreement with his king, he would say, well, okay, Your Highness, I guess I'll just have to resign. And the king would go, no, don't do that. And so that's how he remained powerful. So he wasn't in the position to make those decisions, but he always knew what he wanted from the king. But I don't know what made him. I think a lot of it is timing. Incredibly intelligent individual. So I don't know. What do you think? I know you got thoughts.
No, go ahead.
No.
I just find it fascinating because he couldn't have risen in our culture. I mean, it's a certain place at a certain time in European history, and he was a gambler, not in the sense of casinos, but he was a gambler in that at several points in his career he staked everything on a gamble, denouncing the parliament, forcing unification when Germany wasn't quite ready for it, making the king go to wars that the king didn't want to go to. The king was kind of a weak king and very self-doubting and way less of a will to power than Bismarck had. Bismarck hid behind him all of his life because he wanted to be the prime minister rather than the king himself. But he at a number of points, if things had gone the other way, Bismarck would have wound up on the ash heap of history. He was very lucky in that he was so successful, and he chose that first sort of little starter war against Denmark. He succeeded in the war against Austria because the Prussian army was really well trained and had a very strong discipline, and the Austrian army was unprepared. But it's amazing how many big gambles he took on his way to mastery. And any one of them going the other way, we would not be having this discussion, and Bismarck would be named Edmonton.
So, you pick it up from here.
This is North Dakota. You can't really understand how Bismarck got its name unless you do a little bit of thinking about the NP Railroad. The NP Railroad was authorized in 1864 by Congress, and it had a rough start. It didn't really get started until 1870, 1871, and it was to run from Lake Superior to Puget Sound. And the railroad got an enormous land grant of 47 million acres, giant swath of free land as an incentive because these were ruinously expensive projects. But there was graft and corruption, and it was a very typical sort of Gilded Age project in which fortunes were made and broken and people got caught in corruption schemes and so on. But at any rate, the success of the NP came when Jay Cooke was one of the financiers of the Union cause during the Civil War, when Jay Cooke was persuaded that he should become the principal investment agent of the NP Railroad, and he was able to get enough money for them to start. And according to the charter, they had to start from both ends. They had to start from Duluth, and they had to start from the Puget Sound. They were required to show progress in order to keep their charter. And so he then gets this thing moving, but in 1873, he really has two hats that he's wearing. One is Jay Cooke and Company, and it's essentially the largest financial house in America. This is before federal banking, and it's before the set of safety nets that were put in place after the Depression. And so we are really dependent upon rich financiers, J.P. Morgan, Jay Cooke, and these men have almost unbelievable power. They are essentially personal central banking entities for the United States. And so he has the Jay Cooke and Company, and he also is doing this key work on the NP. And he became so strained on the NP side of it that he wound up sort of neglecting Jay Cooke and Company. In 1873, both go bankrupt. And with the bankruptcy of Jay Cooke and the NP Railroad, America goes into one of its Great Depressions. And this is as great a depression as the Depression of the 1930s. And the railroad had got to Bismarck before this happened, but then the NP is stalled at Bismarck for almost a decade, really until 1880, 1881. And think of that. So you have a transcontinental rail line through one of the least densely populated parts of America, the railroad cannot be profitable and in a sense doesn't even make sense until it can connect itself with the Puget Sound. And it's stalled for 7 or 8 years at the Missouri River right here in Bismarck. So that's the background. And by the way, one of the reasons why the investment pool dried up is because of the Franco-Prussian War. So European investors and American investors are sort of anxious about the Franco-Prussian War, which is a very big war on the continent, and the investment pool dries up. So Bismarck was originally, as I think most people know, called Edwinton, after Edwin Johnson, who was an early director of the NP Railroad. But in 1873, for a number of reasons, to encourage European investors to have confidence in this project, in the hopes of encouraging Europeans to migrate to the United States under the Homestead Act, the NP Railroad changes the name of Edwinton to Bismarck. By the way, they also named Gladstone at that time. Gladstone is named after the British Prime Minister. And then approaches are made to the Iron Chancellor, who is flush with his victories. Would he somehow endorse or help out the cause of the NP Railroad? And so this was a sort of a trial balloon. It'd be a bit in our time like naming something in Syria after George Bush, or using someone's power, or Gorbachev, using someone's international power and celebrity as a way to encourage confidence in this thing. Well, here's what's interesting about this. We did change the name of Edwinton to Bismarck, and it's stayed here ever since, although I'll come back to it. There was one moment when Bismarck almost lost its name. But Otto von Bismarck actually wrote a letter of thanks to the NP and to Bismarck. He wrote this in 1873, and that letter exists, and it's in the State Historical Society of Minnesota. In doing research for this lecture, I came upon this footnote in a book called J. Cook's Gamble by a man named Lubkin, and he has a footnote in which he says the letter of effusive thanks from Otto von Bismarck exists in one of the minute books, one of the folio minute books of the NP in St. Paul. So on the basis of that, Larry, I wrote to the Minnesota Historical Society, which is the counterpart of our own State Historical Society, and asked them if they could... Are
you going to unveil that letter to us?
I wish I could.
Oh.
And asked them if they could look into this for me, and they did look into it for me. And I got a letter, and see if I can find it here, but it was a very sad letter, and it tells you something about the national economy. It said, "Dear Mr. Jenkinson, I regret to inform you that through budget cuts, we do not have a staff sufficient to track this down for you. If you would like to come to St. Paul, you're welcome to look through the 723 volumes of the NP Minute books. Or here's a list of independent scholars that you could hire who would do this, but the budget cuts in Minnesota make this an impossible task for us." What a sad thing this is. We're immune here in North Dakota. We're sitting on top of the Bakken oil field. We have one of 3 budget surpluses in the United States. Our economy is booming. All around us are states that are suffering. And Minnesota, one of the great, most enlightened, best educated states in the country with an incredible historical society, now is so impoverished with budget cutbacks that they can't do a routine little piece. I'm going to go there now. I do believe that in my role as a scholar for you, there is a travel budget. And that's true, isn't it? And I'm planning to go to St. Paul, stay perhaps in the St. Paul Hotel, I don't know, but to go over there and track this down, because here's what I want to do. According to this footnote, it has seals and ribbons, and it's a very, Bismarck was now an extraordinarily powerful man in a very ceremonial society. And apparently the letter is a kind of a work of art. And so what I want to do is to take a digital camera and photograph it, but also get an incredibly high resolution scan of this, and then with our marketing budget, I will have that printed on vellum or some really high quality paper, and you and I will present this to the city of Bismarck, because as far as I know, it's never happened. And that document is from the Iron Chancellor to the city of Bismarck, thanking us for honoring him by naming Bismarck after him. Here's this document sitting in St. Paul. You and I could unearth it, present it to the mayor. We'd be kind of heroes, don't you think?
Yeah, I think we should do that, yeah.
I mean, don't you think that if you're the distinguished humanities scholar at BSE, there should be a travel budget to go do something like this?
I see my bosses out here.
Yeah, but anyway, you see the point.
I have to check.
And we could present this.
I think it'd be great.
I mean, I think it's going to be a very beautiful document. And, you know, he knew English. I doubt that he wrote this letter in English, but we'll get it translated. And we'll have, I mean, I think this could be something really, truly, that could be a remarkable thing for Bismarck to have. From the Chancellor himself, aware of this effort that we made in 1873. It did not change by the way, it didn't change the investment posture or anything else. It turns out if the only reason we changed the name to Bismarck was to make this profitable, it was a futile gesture. But the Chancellor himself seems to have been charmed.
Oh. You have a number of slides.
We got a couple slides here. So now there's a second connection, which is equally interesting. This is not Otto von Bismarck. This is Rutherford B. Hayes, who was our 19th president, one-term president. And Rutherford B. Hayes, some of you will know this story, but this is the same time. It's during that interregnum when the NP is bankrupt and trying to get back on its feet. And really, there can be no North Dakota. There can be no Northwest, you know, from here to Puget Sound, unless you get this transcontinental railroad built. This is an absolutely vital piece of infrastructure for North Dakota. And we would not be a state today if they hadn't been able to get this thing accomplished. So Rutherford B. Hayes is the president in 1877, and the NP, which has gotten 47 million acres, gave President Hayes a farm in Bismarck. They gave him a 930-acre farm 5 miles north of Bismarck. And Hayes, as far as we know, he was the first president to visit North Dakota, but he did not visit his farm. But he had, you know, tenants farm that farm, and it was sold in 1885. And the selling price, remember, it was given to him by the railroad. This is the Gilded Age when this kind of corruption existed all over the place. The farm was sold in 1885 for $23,500. I did the math on this. That would be $518,000 today. So he got a free farm, which in less than 20 years he turned around for an enormous profit. That's what the railroads did, and that's how they got government. That's how they greased the wheels of government in that time. So I wanted to know, where's that farm? Because I don't know if you know this, Larry, but I live 5 miles north of Bismarck.
Okay.
And so I thought,
Are you on the farm?
in Hay Creek Township, which is where his farm was, and I thought, what if I live on Rutherford's farm? So I have friends who do this kind of work, and we went to the Burleigh County Courthouse the other day, and we discovered his farm. Unfortunately,
You're not on it.
I'm not on it, but it's very nearby. I just want to show you this. So here's how you all know how the township systems work. His farm is in Hay Creek Township, and it's section 3. I'll show you where that is. Does anyone know where this is? My house is in 17, so it's a few miles diagonally away. So then, here it is. It is at, if you know where 1804 and 83 have their connection, yeah. And Burnt Creek is on the southeast side of that intersection. So this is not technically the farm, but I'm sure this is where he came for a drink. On the other side, I'll show you, but on the it's an empty section with a house on the corner that's kind of in a little wooded spot. It's a modest little house there on the corner. And then it's still an open section. That's 640 acres of the 930 acres. And this is not it, but I thought this might orient you. I know you frequent this bar, Larry. And this is the corner. So to the right where that grass is begins the Rutherford B. Hayes. It's empty. Now you'll say that this is just kind of hopeless romanticism, but it is empty. Bismarck or Burleigh County or both should buy that section and make this, I'm serious, the Rutherford B. Hayes Park. This city is growing like crazy and is going to eat everything around it. What if there were a section-sized memorial park for the NP and Rutherford B. Hayes right there where there's no development yet? This could be this could be the Central Park of Bismarck someday. I'm serious. We should buy this. And at the very least, we should have a historical sign there at the corner that says, this was President Rutherford B. Hayes' farm.
This is a sign of corruption in
No, it's a part of it. Now, this is a windmill. I'm sure it's not his windmill, but this is on that property. Here's the railroad crossing North Dakota. Gets to Bismarck in 1873, and then it's stalled for those years. Here, now, Larry, this is going to interest you. This is after they got across the river. They began, it's a more rugged country, of course, but they made very rapid progress, and they got to Montana by 1882. But this is cutting west of Bismarck. You see the difficulty of this, but here's what really interested me. You see the guy up on top? Do you see him?
I even hate to see what you got.
No, it's true, but I mean, so I saw this guy, and two things struck me. I hope the audience will agree. You tell me if I'm an idiot, but...
Do I vote?
Yeah. But it reminded me of the Skogans for two reasons. Number one, they're all doing the work and he's just standing up on top. So, and I looked into this. I did some research in the Salt Lake City LDS library, genealogy, and I don't know if you even know this story, but the first Skogan was Hiram Jeremiah Skogan, who was in North Dakota at this time. So I thought, this is probably him. But how can you be sure, really, you know? So luckily, thanks to the digital revolution.
I'm getting set up here.
No, but I mean, clearly, I mean, there was a certain resemblance, but it's hard. It's a bad photograph. So thanks to the digital revolution, you've seen those movies where, like CIA movies, where they do layer after layer of digitally remastering something and getting into greater and greater detail? I did that. It took a couple of weeks, but I've resolved this, and I've gone into a detail, and I think I want to show it to you and see if you think. Are you okay with that? Because this is a mystery. This is what historians do. So there's that, and this believe me, this is expensive software, and it took a long time, and I couldn't do the whole body because it would have been I wouldn't have been able even to show up today. But let me show you what I found. You see if this is Hiram Jeremiah Skogan. Don't you?
Most of these people don't know what you're doing here.
Well, I think they do.
I don't think so.
Well, you tell them.
No, you tell them. You're the guy that showed up with these.
Well, this is how Larry dresses. I was with him last night at a function, and he looked. I actually took this picture last night, but this is your great-great-grandfather, Hiram Jeremiah Skogan, on the bluff, watching the men work. So you see how you're connected to this story, too.
Are we just filling space here? Is that...
Hey, they're laughing at my stuff. So, but my point is that Hayes plus Bismarck plus that place up by Burnt Creek is all part of the same story, and it's the story of how this transcontinental railroad was authorized during the Civil War, and it got here and got stalled, and to unstall it, the railroads greased the wheels of our highest echelons of government to make sure that, the charter had technically been broken, and so to make sure that the government continued to provide this support, but also this initiative was made to Otto von Bismarck, and the city got named for him, and the document exists, and I wasn't joking about that. We can actually get that document. And there's just one more piece of this, that in 1917, when World War I was happening, there was, I don't know if you know this, but there was the last attempt to change the name of Bismarck. And this is serious, that this is from a St. Louis newspaper, and it says this, I'm quoting now from a St. Louis, Missouri newspaper from 1917. The little city of Bismarck is in a squabble as the result of the decision to change its name to Loyal. We thought of changing our name from Bismarck to Loyal because that would show patriotism in the face of World War I. To change its name to Loyal and thus rid itself of the odium of being named after the Iron Duke, who more than any other man was responsible for creating in Germany the diabolical military system which, when filled to the brim, overran and has deluged the world in the blood of its most stalwart sons. So this argument is that we need to change our name because the name Bismarck is now tainted with German-Prussian aggressions during World War I. Isn't that interesting?
That is very
This failed. We did not change the name to, I mean, imagine if you were the president of Loyal State College.
Wouldn't be very exciting.
I mean, this is interesting. Did you know this?
No, I did not.
Since then, we survived that little crisis, but a number of places around the country changed their names during that period from German names to something else because of the shame of the German aggressiveness that they now, in this article, attribute to Otto von Bismarck.
Do you know during World War II, was there such an attempt?
There were, not in Bismarck, there were some places changed their names during this period, but Bismarck, the big movement came during World War I. Okay. So Mike McCormick, do you have any more on this?
Thank you, Mike.
That's it, I'm done.
Okay. All right, so now we're going to wrap this up real quickly. Thank you very much.
Maybe they'll have some questions.
They might have some questions. But I thought we would just very quickly go through the sort of post-unification agenda. Once Bismarck had a unified Germany under the Prussian king, then he had sort of an agenda that he was now going to take on to solidify those conquests. And of course, the economic growth of Germany. The Kulturkampf is really an interesting point here. And when I talked about the Protestant versus Catholic, in 1870, Pope Leo XIII, out of the Vatican Council, that's when they make the determination that the Pope is infallible. And so beginning in 1870, that puts the church in direct conflict with the Prussian king and eventually the emperor. What I didn't know, and Clay, maybe you did, but up to this point, in Bismarck's ministry, there was a department of Catholic worship, and that the Catholic Church chose all the education books for Germany. Why, I don't know. But during this time period, then, after the issue of infallibility, and Germans that would not accept the doctrine of infallibility were being excommunicated. And German professors that would not accept infallibility were being fired from universities. And so Otto von Bismarck said, there is only one sovereign in this country, and that is the king. And so he went direct head-to-head with the Catholic Church for almost a decade.
And serious persecution of Catholics, censorship of sermons, firings of Catholic priests. I mean, this was not just frowning on Catholicism. There was a serious anti-Catholic movement that he led because of this bull of infallibility.
And then the social programs, we've sort of alluded to that in some colonial acquisitions, so we're going to try to do this pretty quickly. One of his biographers said that he didn't create Germany with iron and blood, he did it with iron and coal. Very quickly, once Germany was organized, it became really an economic powerhouse in Central Europe once you've organized that whole area. And Bismarck opted for what he called the American system versus free trade. What Bismarck did is he took a look at the American tariffs, and if you take a look at from the 1850s through the 1900s, when he would have been in power, the American economy was very strong, number one, and had very high tariffs. And so Bismarck says, you know, hooey with these Adam Smith guys over in England that want free trade. We don't want free trade. What we want to do is protect our trade. And so he imposed very high tariffs to help the German economy. And then the social programs, we've already mentioned some of that. Jane, I'm not going to make everybody read all of this, but the bottom line to this is that he's saying that the state has a right, that when has a requirement during bad economic times.
So even though he's a man of a big will to power and uses war as a routine instrument of policy, he has a social conscience, maybe developed from his friendship
With Lassalle.
With Lassalle.
I don't know if I'd call it a social conscience. I think what he did is he said, what we'll do is disarm the socialists.
By co-opting part of their program.
We'll co-opt their program and we'll disarm the socialists. And if the workers can look to the state for protection, then they're not going to run off to these socialist parties. And I think he was very Machiavellian.
But whatever his motives, Larry, he brought about the first welfare state in Europe. And it wouldn't be something that you would have automatically predicted from the first 30 or 40 minutes of what you were saying, that this guy would turn out to be a social democrat in some sense and create a safety net for health and labor protections and so on, and basically the beginnings of the social security system. He does that maybe to co-opt the growing socialist movement in Europe, but it's amazing that he did adopt those things, and they've been a part of first Germany and then Europe ever since.
Yeah. He made a very interesting statement that kind of ties into that. As he said, if I were to follow my sensibilities, I would be a Republican.
Small r.
Small r. I would be a Republican. But because I believe in God, I'm a monarchist. It's very interesting. Okay. Then comes Kaiser Wilhelm II, who takes over in 1888, and immediately Otto von Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm II are at odds. And it really, to us, it sounds like a very small thing, but Bismarck believed that none of the other ministers could talk to the king without going through him. And Kaiser Wilhelm II said that, no, if I want to talk to my ministers, I'll talk to them. And so what Bismarck tries to do, he's in conflict now with the Kaiser, and what Bismarck tries to do is the same thing he tried to do with William I, and that is, hey, I guess, Your Highness, I'll just have to resign. And William II says, okay, fine, which is not what...
So he's put into sort of forced retirement.
So he is forced into retirement. This is a political cartoon, dropping the pilot. And this is Otto von Bismarck in his later years. And now we've got just a bunch of slides here. I don't know if we should even spend time, because we want to get to some questions here, but some of it we'll look on his deathbed. You put these in here. You were going to...
This is, he had two, King William gave him 2 baronial estates as rewards for various wars won and actions completed, and this is one of the 2. It still exists in Prussia, and this is the other one. So these are, what's interesting though, Larry, is that he didn't ever live lavishly. He always lived simply. He wasn't one of those people who created kind of a glittering ambiance around himself. It's not that he never was Spartan, but he didn't take advantage of his power as effectively the Chancellor and Prime Minister of Germany to enrich himself or to surround himself with liveried servants or anything else. He was always a kind of a Junker at heart. He wore hunting gear, had dogs running around the house, had shabby furniture, he didn't ever live in a palace, and so the king gave him these extraordinary estates, which still are there. I think they're now museums, but this was not his MO for being the chancellor.
Is this Frederick's room?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this would be his last home. This is where he died.
There are lots of quotations attributed to Otto von Bismarck, and some of them are really extraordinary. But the most famous Bismarck statement is that he who loves sausage and law should never watch the making of either. And believe me, he's right, at least on the sausage front. But it's not his statement. It's a myth. That is not a statement that originates with Otto von Bismarck. And so far as we know, he never even said it.
And I will admit, until we started doing this research, I have used that often.
But it's not true.
And it's not true. There are statues of Bismarck all over Germany, and some of these you took.
I did.
Here's, I think this was Berlin.
This is his statue in Berlin. I took this picture 2 years ago.
And there's some close-ups.
The fabulous statue.
A point I just want to, and I know we've already said this, but just to emphasize, you know, you look at all these pictures of Bismarck, we think of him as a military man, and he was not. To me, I've just found that so interesting to find out he wasn't a military guy. He's trained as a diplomat, he's a statesman, he's a lawyer, he's educated as a lawyer. And when he started off in the parliament, he always wore suits. He was a civilian. In fact, one of the parliamentarians, after his, you know, sort of iron-willed pushing through stuff, one of the other parliamentarians said, "I'm surprised that he's still wearing civilian clothes." Well, eventually he throws that out and he starts wearing the uniform of a general.
But he wasn't one.
But he wasn't a general.
And, you know, but this is something that he said. This is one of his other most important quotations. Anyone who has ever looked into the glazed eyes of a soldier dying on the battlefield will think hard before starting a war. So he was not a warmonger. I mean, that's a common misconception of him. He wasn't really a warrior himself, although he sort of danced around the edges of several of the wars that he helped to create. But he was appalled by war. He was not one of those who believed that war was glorious. That's part of the Prussian spirit, but it wasn't part of Otto von Bismarck's spirit. He believed that war was a simple instrument of policy, that there was nothing glorious about it whatsoever, except victory.
This was a Milwaukee newspaper ad I found. Actually, what they're doing is they're railing against the idea of prohibition. And obviously, Bismarck, the greatest of the Germans, would not approve of prohibition, if you read it all. Of course, the Bismarck, ship the Bismarck. Clay, you can get a beer stein with Otto's face on it, or a T-shirt, or even a cartoon.
I have one.
You got one? Okay,
Yeah.
good. I found this interesting when I was doing this research. This is Stephanie zu Guttenberg. She is the great-granddaughter of Otto von Bismarck and is the wife of Germany's Minister of Defense. So the Bismarcks are still very, very much here. In fact, Michael, you've had a Bismarck visit before here, right? You want to give him the mic, Lori, please?
When we had the centennial Bismarck, the great-grandson of Bismarck was here and appeared like a sovereign prince walking around the town. And it's interesting because I remember meeting him briefly, but everybody treated him as a sovereign prince. They almost kowtowed to him as he walked around the city. So, and he's been back since then, I think.
Once more recently.
Yeah, he's been back. We've kept in contact. As long as I have the microphone. One addenda. Jay Cook is an interesting man, and one of the reasons why he got so involved in financing the railroad is that he had lots of personal land he held in Minnesota, so that if the railroad succeeded, then his land values would go up and his personal fortunes would do well, too.
Thank you, Mike.
Larry, let me also give you another couple of statements by Bismarck that I think are really extraordinary. One is, I have seen 3 emperors in their nakedness, and the sight was not inspiring.
Let me comment on that. What I found interesting, as you read Bismarck, there's a lot of times when you're reading about him, he holds the monarchy almost in contempt. During the Franco-Prussian War, he's talking to somebody, and a prince rides by, and the person is distracted by all the finery, you know, and Bismarck gets upset at him, and he says, "Let princes be princes. We got work to do." You know, so he almost holds royalty in contempt, yet he, for whatever reason, believes in the divine rights and is always a servant to the king. So very complex man.
Here's another one. The secret of politics: make a good treaty with Russia. And one of his maxims was never fight a two-front war. That you can almost always win a one-front war if you have the national will and resource base and discipline, but you should never, under any circumstances, fight a two-front war, which is why he got Austria to help him with Denmark and then got France to help him with Austria. He always, before he would fight one of these strategic wars, would go in diplomatically and neutralize all of the countries that might side with the country he intended to attack. And of course, there's a huge historical debate about whether Adolf Hitler is an extension of Prussian militarism or whether it's an anomaly, but Hitler's great mistake was that he violated Bismarck's principle and tried to fight a two-front war. And then one more, says Bismarck, there is a providence that protects idiots, drunkards, children, and the U.S. So somehow he was grudgingly acknowledging American exceptionalism, that we are the most fortunate country on earth and we don't seem to get ground up by any of these European struggles.
One of the, just last thing to go over, Clay and I were sitting the other night writing down sort of a France-Germany, how their relationship has gone. And it's really interesting because in 1806, Napoleon is imposing conditions on Prussia. In 1815, the rest of everybody's doing it on France. In 1870, Prussia does it again to France. 1919, Europe is back doing it to Germany. 1940, Germany's back doing it to France again. And of course, in 45, then we Germany's divided by the Allies, and up to 89, and the Berlin Wall falls, and the reunification. I can remember, and I'm sure many people here, about discussions when they were talking about a reunified Germany. I remember people talking, I was still in the military at the time, France will never let Germany reunify. I mean, all they had to do is look at their history. But they did, and we're in a different place today.
Well, the jury's still out. I mean, it's early, but go ahead.
Nope, that's it.
I just wanted to go back to a point that Mike was making, then we'll take questions. But, Bismarck is named for, it's an NPL-related naming. The NPL, or sorry, the NP, the Northern Pacific Railroad, it'd be very interesting to look at the way North Dakota got named in the face of railroads. Beach, for example, is named for a lieutenant in the Army, the 11th Infantry, that was doing the surveys for the NP as it prepared to leave Mandan and go into the west. Belfield is named for it's thought to be named for the daughter of an NP official. Taylor is named for an NP agent in Mandan who also had a drugstore here. Stark County is named for George Stark, who was an NP official. That kind of upset me because I've always thought that Stark County was named for its starkness, which I sort of like, but it's not. It's named for just a guy. Sims is named for George V. Sims, who was an NP official. Bismarck, of course. Driscoll is named for the editor of the St. Paul Pioneer Press, which was the NP's official newspaper. Sanborn is named for an NP official. Cass was the president of the Northern Pacific. We get Cass County, Castleton, Cass Clay Dairy, etc. Fargo, Mr. Fargo was not just Wells Fargo, he was also one of the directors of the NP. Perham was the name of the first president of the NP. Brainerd was the last name of the wife of an NP official. Moorhead was an NP, and that's just a portion of them. If you go along the line, including its spurs, the naming of North Dakota along the I-94 NP corridor is extraordinarily heavily determined. In Bismarck, Rosser is named after the chief engineer of the NP. In Dickinson, Villard Street is named after the German financier, and Billings, Montana is named after Frederick Billings, who was the president of the NP. You do a names account of the NP line, and you see what an extraordinary power that railroad had on the development, the infrastructural planning of North Dakota. Not only is the NP line the line, but it became Highway 10 and then Interstate 94. It's also the line of our cable and high fiber systems. It's unbelievably important, and if we wind up shipping water to Fargo, as is almost certainly to happen, the pipeline, if that's the way it goes, will also be along the I-94 corridor. So you can never exaggerate the influence of the NP on the history of the Great Plains and the history of North Dakota. And the city of Bismarck is only called Bismarck because of the NP's financial troubles in the 1870s.
The last thing I'm going to say, and then we're going to take some questions here, and that is, if you're interested in what you saw on some of the maps that I had here, I see Marlene's here, I should say that Those maps I got off of, through our library, there's a database called Maps A to Z. A to Z Maps. And you can go on there, and there's hundreds of maps on that, and it's just really a lot of fun to have that resource. So are there any questions for us? We do have a microphone. We're going to ask you to speak with the mic because they are taping this, and if you have a microphone, it'll pick it up.
Mike has a question.
Michael has a question.
Just a comment. Thank you for evangelizing the name of Bismarck. I talked to Larry Clay earlier, and I said when I was when we had the centennial of Bismarck, we had a tremendous celebration. God, we had a pageant and everything else. And the Germans sent a film crew from Munich, and they set up downtown Bismarck, and they were trying to get the ambiance of this town named after Iron Chancellor. And it was a little bit like jaywalking. They would stop people and ask, what's Bismarck named for? And it was just like jaywalking, because we were named after a jelly donut, among other things. They couldn't get a straight answer, and then towards the end of the afternoon, they were down by the old post office in the center square, and they had a camera set up, and there's this guy walking by with a year-old baby, and they grabbed him aside and said, what was Bismarck named for? And he said it was named for the Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, to bring in German bonds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he looked and said, Sehr gut, what do you do? I said, I'm named Mike McCormack. I'm a professor at Bismarck Junior College. He said, oh! my only moment of fame.
Great story, Mike. Are there any other questions? I know the hour grows late here.
Larry, can I tell you our dream? I mean, we haven't talked about our dream.
Oh,
In
yeah.
addition to getting the document from the St. Paul History Center,
Yeah.
you saw those beautiful pictures. Can we go back to them of that I was able to bring back of Otto von Bismarck?
Yeah.
Stay with me now. Why don't we have a statue of Bismarck in Bismarck?
That's what I say, by golly.
No, I'm serious.
No, I'm agreeing.
We
This is
should
our
have
dream.
we should have, here's what I want to do. And I want us to make a sister city friendship with Schönhausen or one of these places that Bismarck is most heavily associated with, or a place that has a college like ours. And then we will do something for them, and they'll do something for us. They will give us a statue of Otto von Bismarck. And it won't be this high, that's 200 feet high, but it'll be a very serious statue, probably of this, a cast of this, of Otto von Bismarck, and we'll put it in a prominent place in Bismarck. Sorry?
Huh?
On the campus.
Clay's New Park, yeah.
And then, but here's the quid pro quo. As you know, the Germans are absolutely fascinated by the frontier and Native American culture, and particularly by Prince Maximilian and Karl Bodmer, who were here in the 1830s. And when David Borlaug and I went to Maximilian's home in southern Germany a couple of years ago, we saw in his hometown a statue of forebears, our own Matotope, because Maximilian and Bodmer formed a friendship with forebears, and he's painted by Bodmer a number of times. But it's just a small statue in a small provincial part of Germany. What if they give us a monumental von Bismarck, and then we commission a monumental statue of Matotope and present it to our sister city? And then in addition to that, we have here Bismarck Days in the fall with an Oktoberfest and a lecture series and German films, and you send a couple of professors to them every year, and they send a couple of professors to us, and we have our high schools do exchange programs with our sister city, and we start to take advantage of our status as Bismarck. Don't you think we ought to do that?
Absolutely.
So will you make that happen?
Well, we'll work on that.
Don't you think we should do this?
Yeah.
Otto von Bismarck,
Otto von Bismarck.
in downtown Bismarck,
Downtown.
a statue of this great man are up here on the campus,
Yeah. I'm all on board.
overlooking the bridge at the NP, which he almost might have funded if he weren't so unwilling.
Are there any questions at all?
That one back
There's
there.
a question back here. We've got a microphone here, please.
Go ahead.
Who might this letter have been directed to in Bismarck, and why is it in St. Paul? Or did they have a historical society?
I can tell you
before
why
we
it's in
did, I
St.
guess?
Paul. A lot of the NP's records are in the Minnesota Historical Society, and they literally have the world's greatest deposit of NP records. And so it's worth going to see those. And they've told me on the phone there are so many of them that it would be almost impossible, to sort them out or publish them. But this document apparently it does exist in one of the minute books. And I don't know enough yet about this, but I'm thinking that it might be Villard, who was himself German-born, who might have had a role in the scheme to get the Chancellor involved. But the NP named the railroad spot Gladstone, too, after the Prime Minister of Great Britain. So it may be that they were sort of fishing for endorsements, but no one's ever tracked this down. It should be ascertainable by spending a few days in the St. Paul History Center. That's it, Larry.
If it was written in gratitude, it probably went to the organization that the Burley County Board of Commissioners are the ones that actually named this one. So they have gone to Burley County, to the Board of Commissioners itself.
So there might there are records of that?
I don't know. I have no idea. But as I remember reading, they were the ones who proclaimed it Bismarck, so wouldn't the letter go to them?
Maybe.
For those that didn't hear that, Michael was saying it should have gone to the Burley County Board of Commissioners, that letter from the Iron Chancellor. Well, we'll have to find out.
We're going to get the letter. That's
we'll
easy.
follow up on that.
The rest of the paper trail might be the hard part, but that letter will tell us something because it's addressed to somebody. It's either addressed to Burley County or the people of North Dakota or to the NP, but it's addressed to somebody, and once we see that, we'll know something more about it. But the footnote that I read in Jay Cook's Gamble said that it was addressed to the NP. Whether that's true or not, we'll find out.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming to spend your Sunday afternoon with us, and we hope to see you in December.